I grew up in the 50s in a very segregated South. However, we were the only blacks on the street. I lived about 3 to 4.5 blocks from the Citadel. It's the finest, one of the finest military institutions in the United States. As a matter of fact, at one time I was there for about a year in graduate school. But nevertheless, I was raised by my grandparents. My grandfather was a college professor and a minister. My grandmother was a principal of a school, and my mother was a teacher. My father, during the late 70s, early 80s, there were only 3 black superintendents of education in the state of South Carolina, and he was one of them. I was an only child. I grew up in a house of privilege. I had no idea about segregation. It just never occurred to me that that was the kind of thing that was going on because of the way that we lived. We had housekeepers. It was not out of necessarily affluence, but it was a necessity. Everybody worked, and rather than my grandparents wanting me to be a latchkey kid, they just had someone at the house when I was there. And my grandmother hated to cook when she came home, so that's how it was. My greatest impacts were from my grandparents. My grandmother was my first Rosa Parks. There wasn't any bus driver who was not afraid of her in Charleston. She would get on the bus, and the first thing she would say, with me in hand, "I sit any damn where I please." And she would sit down, and she would sit down right behind the bus driver. And I think this is why today, since I've been in Washington, D.C., riding in on buses, I make it a point to sit at the front. And it's not because I'm a senior, it's not because of anything, it's really a Southern thing, and it was because of how my grandmother raised me. I went to boarding schools, I went to private schools, I went to a private HBCU in Greensboro, North Carolina by the name of Bennett. My undergraduate degree was in...
Is this switch on the...
There's a switch physically.
My undergraduate degree was in performing arts, and I did very well. When I graduated from college, I married who I fell in love with when I was 15 years old. My husband was considerably older than I was, but when I was 15, I saw him. He was a pilot in the military, and I just fell in love with him. And 4 years later, I married him. Right after college, we moved to Pensacola, Florida. He continued flight training down there, and he made rank very fast because of the type of training he was in. We moved all over the world, literally. I had 3 children. We lived in the same manner that I grew up in because he was an officer. And everything was just afforded to us. I never had to work because I never wanted to. I was trained by my grandmother and my mother, you don't have to when a man has money and he works for you. And that's what I saw when I grew up, and that's how it was for me. We got down to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I did not want to live in base housing anymore, so I demanded that a private home be built for me. My husband built it for me. It was a beautiful home. We moved in May of '76, and that June he got orders to go to Hawaii, and I told him I had no intentions of leaving the house, and I wasn't going to move anymore. The military was very consistently inconsistent as far as stability. There was none for me, and I was not used to that. And so with my brat-only entitled self, I decided that I was going to stay there and file for divorce. He didn't believe me. It was a very terrible divorce, and one of the ways he punished me was not to give me money. And so what I had to finally do was sell the house, and I moved up here to Washington, D.C. I stayed with my father's sister. And she knew I had never worked, and she said, "Well, Jackie, you're going to have to do something." And so what I did was I finally got a job working in one of the state institutions before deinstitutionalization, and that was Forest Haven. I worked there for a while, and I had no idea that I loved working with the mentally retarded or mentally ill. And as a result of that, a colleague of mine said that I would not be going anywhere or moving in that position unless I got a master's degree. And what I did was I applied to get a master's at GW. I was full scholarship. I maintained a 3.9 as I knew that I would, because my whole family was accomplished and everything. We were goal-oriented. It was very driven for us to be accomplished and to make it and to succeed. And my grandfather never believed in civil rights. He said your education was your civil rights. He said that the written word was your liberty, and he said that would always be your freedom. And so what I did was I got my master's. After that, I worked in DC public school system. I was a director eventually in setting up programs. I got my master's in special ed in transition. And basically what that meant was I was trained to work with a lot of adjudicated youths. I went before judges, did a lot of due process hearings, made sure that because of their entitlements, they had a right to keep their educational status even though they were in jail. There were a lot of judges who did not feel that way, including their probation officers, but we were able to continue that for them. Then there was an opportunity that I had. There was a lawyer who approached me and asked me would I do evaluations for him that would complete the due processing, that would complete the due process period for the students. I made a very bad decision in that because I looked at the money. But I was not told that if I got evaluations done today that I would not get paid until sometimes a year later. And unfortunately, the first 5 evaluations I got, I was able to get paid up front first. And because the evaluations paid so well, I quit my job in the public school system. And after I had done the 7th, 8th, and 9th evaluation, I waited for my money and I never got it. I was told by the attorney that I would not get paid until that spring, and I had done the evaluations the summer before. Where I was staying at the time, I was not able to continue to rent from my landlord. She told me that I was behind in my rent. She said that she would not keep me there any longer. She also let me know that she was not running a homeless shelter and that I had to leave. That was my first experience staying out on the streets for about 5 nights. It wasn't a good experience for me. I left with Louis Vuitton luggage. I had 2 houseplants, and I had a cell phone. And I walked to, I was out in Silver Springs, and I walked to Langley Park. And I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but it is not the best place in the world. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, I stopped this policeman and asked him, would he help me? And he looked at me and he said, well, ma'am, you're telling me that you want me to take you to a homeless shelter and you have designer luggage and houseplants and a cell phone. And he leaned forward to smell my breath to see if I was drunk, and I told him I was not. And so he said that he would help me, and he took me to this terrible shelter where every iconic stereotype person you could ever think of that you saw in TVs or movies or wherever, it was terrible. People were hanging out on the street. 2 guys looked like they were drunk. There were another 3 in the back fighting. And the cop turned around and looked at me and said, ma'am, do you honestly want me to leave you here? And I said, no, sir, I do not. So he drove me back to the parking lot where he met me and just left me there. And he said, ma'am, you have a good night. I stayed out on the street again that night. That was on a Saturday. That Sunday morning, I walked to a church. Don't remember where it was. And I told the minister's wife what was going on. And I said that I'm not going to sleep on the streets another damn night, and could you please help me? And she said, well, if you stay to the afternoon service, I will invite you to stay, because there's a lady that I think that can help you. And sure enough, I was off the street that night, but little did she tell me was that the lady that got me off the street had a string of group homes. Her group home staff only consisted of people who were derelicts, who were homeless, who had every type of criminal background you can imagine. These were people that no one else would hire, and possibly were not even supposed to be in the United States. And so she hired me, and I worked there for almost 5 years. And there was a staff of 12 criminally insane men in that house, and I was supposed to have at least 3 staff working with me, and no one ever showed up. I asked an immediate supervisor when was help coming, and she laughed at me and she said, "No help is coming, and you need to be grateful, Jackie, because you got off the streets, and this is your job, and if you don't like it, you can damn well go back out there." And so I didn't say anything for a couple of years because I was afraid, because I had nowhere to go. In the meantime, I could not call my family because they would have been ashamed of me. And as I said, I came from a family where terrible things did not happen. My mother and my grandmother made sure of it. Even though we were black, they made sure it was a lily-white environment for all of us, and not in the context of race, but in the context of just perfection. And so I could not call anyone. I could not tell anybody what was going on. And so what happened was I finally broke down after I had been in the hospital for the weekend because I thought I was having a heart attack. The doctor at that time told me that I needed to make a